Well, I'm super excited. My next guest joining us, he's been on the air on these airwaves with me before, but in a different capacity. He's now in a new position, been there for about 6 weeks, and he is now the president of the Illinois Railroad Association. Former state representative Tim Butler with us. So typically, we call people by the last title they had. So, I would say thanks for taking time, Representative. But now do I say thanks for taking time, Mr. President?
Well, President's a great title. So Tim is good enough. So
right on. Well,
right.
Thanks for joining me and
on
such short notice. Just to give a little bit of behind the curtain here. I'm doing show prep in the morning, getting all my notes together, and I'm like, I kind of want to talk about some of the situation that's been happening with rail across the country. But here in Springfield, we have a lot of rail improvements that have been happening, and elsewhere throughout the state, a lot of tax dollars going into rail improvements. But I wanted to talk with the former representative, who's now the president of the Railroad Association here in Illinois, and he responded quickly. I mean, it was like 4:30 in the morning when you responded, and you said, "Yeah, I can be there."
Yeah.
So thanks for taking time. But let's get into it. You've been in the position for 6 weeks now.
About 6 weeks, January 1st. So started as president of the Railroad Association. We are a nonprofit association that represents the interests of the freight rail industry in the state of Illinois. So there's all 7 Class 1 railroads. We're the only state that has all the Class 1s are the ones that haul freight across the country. So the Union Pacifics, the BNSFs, CSX, things like that. And then also, we have short line and regional railroads. So you might have a short line railroad that runs a few miles, or just maybe a couple dozen miles across the state, things like that. And so in total, we have about 50 freight railroads that operate in Illinois. About almost 7,000 miles of track in Illinois when it comes to freight rail. We are the leading state in the nation when it comes to freight rail.
And I think people don't necessarily realize that when we think of Illinois, especially with some of the rural areas being, you can go a long distance and then not see a railroad, but then there's one going right through a rural area.
100 of the 102 counties have railroads.
I bet. No question. But when it comes to, looking at a statewide map, as compared to the rest of the country, it's almost like we're the major artery of all of this major transportation that goes through. But I wanted to bring you on to talk a little bit about what we're seeing across the country, with especially in East Palestine, Ohio, with the train derailment there and the chemicals that are there. Talk a bit about, how rail improvements across Illinois may or may not impact the possibility of similar train derailments.
Well, I will say, again, being on this job for 6 months, 6 weeks, rail safety is at the top of the list that gets discussed every single day with these companies. It gets, it's in the DNA of these companies, safety for their employees, safety for the communities and the citizens that they serve, and then they go through. It's at the top of the list that these freight rail companies operate on. And so when we make investments in improving rail in Illinois, and the other thing that people probably don't know about, the companies themselves, the freight rail companies, invest billions annually these are private companies with the rails are privately owned. All the rail track is privately owned. $20 billion gets invested annually across the country every year going into rail, which is creating safer rails across the country. But here in Illinois, we have some really important projects. We have one right here in Springfield that we've talked about before, that we're very familiar with, the consolidation with the 3rd Street tracks to the 10th Street tracks, and all these safety features, including the grade separations and the grade closings. I mean, we've seen it here recently in town. We've had a couple tragic incidents where we've had some people that have died getting hit by trains because they get caught on the tracks, or suicides. Dying by suicide is also a really big issue as well that the railroads try to prevent. So the more that we can do to create grade separations helps with safety, but also helps with people getting around town easier. So you've seen that with the 10th Street tracks. In Chicago area, there's a huge program called CREATE that's been around for 2 decades that has over 70 projects on it, 30 of which have been completed, to really untangle everything that goes into the rail system in Illinois. Like you said, when you look at Chicago especially, it's the epicenter of rail in the country, and that's been around for almost 2 centuries now,
Sure.
to a century and a half, because when we started building rail, a lot of it emanated out of Chicago. A lot of the communities in Illinois built up around railroads. And so we make a lot of investments into safety. It's really important, and that's why it's good to see the state step up through the capital plan to invest in this, because I think it's good. It's good for the industry, and it's good for the people of Illinois to create safer rails.
We're talking with Tim Butler. He is the president of the Illinois Railroad Association, and getting a little bit more in depth into the investments that are made into rail and how that could help curb any potential rail problems, derailments, trains that go through. Talk a bit about the types of freight there is. Of course, there's a lot of agricultural products. I drive over some tracks every morning on my way here, and I always see coal cars that are, sometimes empty, sometimes full. It's fascinating to see that kind of fluctuation. But talk about some of the other items that there are that might have that air of concern about what we saw in East Ohio.
Basically, everything you touch every day probably at some point was transported by rail, whether it's a finished product or the materials that go in it. One of my favorite stories that I've heard recently was the fact that if you've ever been to the Chris Kindle Market in Chicago, it's just around the holidays. It's kind of German-themed markets that they have a couple of them in Chicago. The big thing is to get your mug with the hot whatever cider or whatever. Those mugs got delivered on a train from one of my, and cool things like that. But yeah, it's also the chemicals that go into. Obviously, what we've seen with the terrible accident in Ohio, those are chemicals, vinyl chloride. That goes into making plastics. So if you're drinking out of a plastic bottle or something like that, that could be stuff that goes into that. And we're the industry is almost required to carry those things when another business reaches out to us and says, we want you to transport it. And on top of that, rail transport is tremendously safe. Obviously, these high-profile incidents bring a lot of focus to it, and rightly so. Things like this should come under intense scrutiny and find out what caused it. I know those investigations are going on, and certainly the concerns of the people on the ground. I wouldn't want that to happen in my community. They don't want it to happen in their community. The Norfolk Southern certainly doesn't want this to happen. But the reaction of the federal government and the company is what's important here, and make sure that the people are safe, and make sure moving forward that hopefully this kind of stuff doesn't happen again. And that's why, again, back to what I said originally, that the focus on safety in the industry is important. Everything gets carried. I laugh. You mentioned the coal. I was coming down 55 and looked over one night on the UP tracks that run up 55, and there's a giant wind turbine blade going down the rails. Yeah, sure. So you have kind of both ends of the energy spectrum that get transported through that. Chemicals, all those the intermodal units, the ones that look like the semis that are on tracks that you see going, especially through the 3rd Street tracks in Springfield. Those are goods that get shipped either in or out of the country. A lot of time finished goods that get shipped or out. You have rail cars that ship automobiles. Yep. So I know like Rivian ships their stuff on rails, things like that. So it's a wide range of things that get shipped via railroads, and it's such an important industry to our state and to our nation for the economy of our nation. It really moves all the stuff we need.
Well, and talk to about, I guess, the difference between transporting what could be hazardous materials on busy interstates with a lot of variables that aren't controlled. And I'm talking about speeding vehicles or reckless drivers or things like that, and how that is totally different than what you get with a dedicated line that nobody else is on, that train's on. How is that safer transporting some of these hazardous materials?
Yeah, so for hazardous materials, over 99.99% of the hazardous materials get transported safely, no releases, things like that. It's a tremendously safe way to transport. And as you said, this is basically an enclosed transportation system. When a train goes down the tracks, when you go through intersections, gates come down, warnings happen, things like that. And it's very scheduled and monitored by the industry. I had a great briefing for the CREATE program up in Chicago, and there's a center in downtown Chicago where you can see all the railroads have come together, which was really unique because they're private businesses that are competitors as well. That all the businesses come together, and you can see on the big screens in front of you, it's like the big war room of where all this stuff is in the Chicago, they call it the Chicago terminal, the region around Chicago, where trains are going in and out of yards and things like that. So it's a very controlled environment that they know what's going on. And it's tremendously safe. Yes, we have accidents just like anyone else. But you're right, on interstates and highways, look, our friends in the trucking industry do a great job, but they have a lot of other factors that we don't have in the rail industry, like you pointed out. People speeding past you, coming up in intersections that you might not know about.
Cutting you off,
yeah. And that's a real, you don't have road rage on rails like you do on interstates. And so I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that these are kind of enclosed, controlled ways to transport it that are tremendously safe.
And finally here, we did have the issue a couple of weeks ago that the negotiations between the rail companies and the labor that are associated with rail. Talk about the importance of getting that right, especially in the context of safety and making sure that things operate and the trains run on time, so to speak.
So if everybody remembers back to right before the holidays, there was concern about a rail strike, and then the contract, which had been negotiated between the private companies and the union, and then the president stepped in and basically said, hey, we don't need a rail strike, and implemented a contract, which is the right of Congress and the president to do it under federal law to keep things moving throughout the country. That was tremendously important. A historic contract, 24% wage increase. Our rail employees here in Illinois average $134,000 in wages and benefits. It's a great job. But I think there's always room to be better. You've seen CSX, which is one of the big rail lines, have made deals with some of their unions recently around sick leave, and so there's always stuff to be improved on. But certainly, part of what the rail industry wants to do is take care of their employees and make sure they're doing the right thing by that. And I think they're going to continue to do that going forward. You certainly don't want to see a contract implemented, by the government. That's not the way it should be. But to keep things moving in the country, that's what happened. And it's a good contract for the employees.
Former State Representative Tim Butler, now the president of the Illinois Railroad Association. Am I honored with this being your first radio interview?
This is my first radio interview since I've been on, and nobody calls me anymore. So it's and I got my weekends back. It's fun, so I'll take it, no problem. Well, I haven't been to a pancake breakfast in a few months.
Well, somebody, for crying out loud, invite this man to a pancake breakfast, okay? Well, hey, no, I appreciate it. Let's talk again in the near future.
I love it.
Listen, I mean, Illinois really is kind of like the central hub of major transportation, and it's something I think people need to understand more. It's not just a bunch of highway systems. You've got those very important
rivers,
rail systems.
Rails, air, everything.
I mean, there's a reason why Abe Lincoln wanted to ensure that we had proper transportation, because he understood the importance of it living in Illinois. President Tim Butler, thank you so much for taking time. We'll talk soon. It is Springfield's Morning News on 92.7 WMAY, now 8:23 from Culver's West on Wabash.
It's time to apply at Culver's West.